And Loco, can I just first of all start off by congratulating you as the first and biggest Stormgate streamer?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I just switched my stream category to Stormgate. I found out there is one, which is pretty amazing. Yeah. So first off, what can people in the StarCraft world know you for? Because I obviously am well aware of what you've done to StarCraft 2, but maybe a little bit of backstory would be nice for people that are not as familiar.
Yeah, I guess in terms of StarCraft 2, I got my start on a little indie site called Team Liquid. Back in the day, I was like the sixth person on Team Liquid, and I mostly started off as a volunteer writing strategy guides, and then I went off to writing recaps and previews of various MLGs and BlizzCons and whatnot. I founded a mini subdivision of Team Liquid called TL Strategy, in which we gathered the group and we just came up with strategy guides and released them to the public. From then on, I eventually joined Blizzard as the lead co-op designer, where I developed some of the latest co-op commanders such as Tychus, Zeratul, Minx, and Stedman. And I also worked on balance during my time there on the StarCraft team, and I was heading the balance in 2020. And from then on, I eventually moved on to Frost Giant and to working on what we now know as Stormgate.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess like as they say, the rest is history.
Yeah, I remember you mentioned this. I think in this probably was like 2015 or 2016 or so at BlizzCon, I believe. And you said to me that you were going to be joining Blizzard next year and you're going to be taking over the co-op team. I was like, okay, sure you are. Sure you are. I actually wasn't sure if you were, for real at the time. But I think I probably told you that I didn't believe you. But anyways, here we are.
Yeah, it's pretty unbelievable for myself because I got news that I got the job like a day or two before I talked to you about it, which is like a day or two before BlizzCon. So it was kind of surreal
Ah,
participating at BlizzCon doing like press for Team Liquid, but at the same time, like knowing the day before that I would be like working for Blizzard in the next month or so.
right. Yeah, I thought it was some sort of elaborate troll. And then at some point, it was announced as well in official news. I was like, oh, crap. I guess he, wasn't joking around.
Yeah, that's
Um,
kind of a weird troll, I guess.
yeah, yeah. I was like, I don't know exactly what's happening
Uh,
here because I think I believe interviewing David as well, who was like I think doing co-op before you, like
mhm.
at the same event about co-op too. So I was a little bit confused about the whole thing, but yeah, that's awesome. So what do you do primarily at Frost Giant these days?
Yeah, these days I'm a lead designer here at Frost Giant, primarily focusing on gameplay. So kind of the what happens within a given game, both in the co-op mode and the co-op and in the competitive modes at Stormgate. So a lot of the moment-to-moment gameplay is what I'm working on right now.
Okay. Yeah, so I've got a bunch of questions about, well, most of the categories that you guys have announced. But real basic for people that may not be aware yet, what is Stormgate?
Yeah, Stormgate is a Blizzard-style RTS that we're working on right now, and we believe it's going to be the first truly social RTS. We back in the StarCraft 2 days, we realized that even though StarCraft 2 is a multiplayer game, and even though there's chat, we got a lot of feedback that StarCraft 2 is a very like solitary experience. You're often like going at it very alone, and that's for a variety of factors. So for Stormgate, our goal is that every individual mode of this game is as great of a social experience as possible. So we ask questions like, how do we allow you to experience the game with other people? Um, we believe that the social aspect of games these days is part of the variety and part of a key ingredient of what makes a lot of games successful, such as MOBAs, battle royales, and Roblox, for example.
Mm-hmm.
We hope to be a better and less intimidating experience for new players, and we want to make it viral so that you are able to bring players and bring your friends into the game. So I can kind of talk about like what that means for each of our individual modes as well.
Okay. No, that's great. Yeah, so I think one of the main reasons why a lot of people are keeping very close eye on Stormgate is because of the fact that a lot of ex Blizzard employees work there these days, and a lot of people that made my personal favorite RTS games over the years, like for example StarCraft and Warcraft. Now, one question I've seen pop up over the last few days, and I've had people asking me this directly as well: isn't RTS in general just dead? I've had this question over the years too, and I've always answered it by saying that most of the time it seems that the gaming industry on its own has grown significantly, and that RTS has just sort of remained stable as far as absolute numbers go. But I was wondering about your opinion about that.
Yeah, honestly, you took my answer there, so
Oh, okay.
loco. But yeah, the way I see it is like, yeah, gaming has just grown so much over the past few years. You have all these genres. You have the rise of mobile, of course. Whereas RTS, there hasn't been as much innovation. It's remained more stagnant than some of the other genres. And the way I see it, just like the way you see it, is that the pie is growing bigger. And relative to the pie, RTS is a smaller section of the pie. But
Hmm.
relative to just pure player numbers, I think RTS has it been similar or even grown in the last like 10 or 20 years or so.
Yeah. Now, personally, I've seen just complete stable numbers on YouTube and on Twitch and stuff. Like, I haven't really seen a decrease or anything along those lines. But yeah, you're probably right that like the other games have just outgrown it, I suppose. So with Stormgate being based primarily on Blizzard RTS games, or at the very least that seems to be one of the focuses, where do you think like StarCraft and Warcraft like went wrong? I suppose like where is like the majority of the improvement gonna come from?
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily frame it as like where StarCraft and Warcraft went wrong. I would say that I think the designers and the teams at the time like did the best with like their goals at the time, and the goals of Stormgate right now are just a little different from the goals of games that came 10 years ago or 20 years ago, right? So, for example, we want it to be a more social experience. Social experiences weren't seen as valuable as they are right now, I would say. Just in the past few years, for example, we've seen the advent of these like MOBAs, these like games like Among Us, games like Fall Guys. And they've really captured people and allowed people to bring their friends into these games to create that viral experience. So if there's one thing that you could say like those games like quote unquote went wrong or
Mm-hmm.
and I definitely wouldn't phrase it that way. It's
No.
that it's like the lack of a focus on some of the social aspects.
Okay. Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, so especially in one versus one, I suppose in StarCraft 2, it's a pretty lonely experience, especially when half the opponents you go up against are barcode players. So I can imagine for like co-op and for campaign, it's a little bit easier to tackle that social aspect. How would you imagine doing that in a one versus one?
Yeah, I would say that so one of the innovations that we have in Stormgate is that uh, we're going to have actually two separate core competitive modes. The first is going to be our 1v1 core mode, in which players will compete in a very traditional Blizzard style RTS format, where it's really going to be about the road to mastery and being the best player as that you can on an individual basis. We're also going to be focusing on a 3v3 team battle mode, in which we're going to design the rules from the ground up to be the best social experience possible. So as far as I'm aware, Stormgate will be the first RTS, the first Blizzard RTS that kind of rewrites the rules for a team game from the ground up. And a lot of other RTSs, like let's say StarCraft, for example, the rules for a team game are copy and pasted from the 1v1. So you have these weird things where like you can't build on your allies creep, for example. That's a very hyper
Right.
specific example, but that's like some of the things that we're thinking about. So let me just give you an example of something more general. In RTS, in team-based RTS, it's really the only competitive genre where you can really eliminate your players. If you think about the other big team games, let's think about like MOBAs or FPS, for example. When you as a player, when you as an individual die, you just respawn a few seconds or a few minutes later. But when you think about RTS, the express goal of an RTS or a team-based RTS in general is to eliminate a player, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to completely eliminate them from the game, which we feel like is a really unfun experience for teammates. And for the player himself. So we're really trying to iterate that and make sure that, for example, individual teammates cannot be eliminated.
Okay. Right. So would that change as well, like the overall objective? Whereas right now in a game of 3v3, for example, your goal is to I guess, eliminate all of the other opponents? Are you guys looking into like different win conditions as far as that goes?
Yeah, well, one of the things that we're looking into is the separation of the win condition from the 1v1 mode and the 3v3 mode.
Okay.
If we take a look at traditional Blizzard style RTS win conditions, it's the idea of I like to call it annihilation, where you kill every building of your opponents. You completely eliminate them. Um, for a team-based RTS, we feel like that makes less sense because of the things that we talked about.
Right.
However, we think Annihilation for 1v1 is it's number one, it's a very tried and tested game mode. It's been very effective and very it works very well for Blizzard style RTSs. Some of the benefits include it allows for a very high diversity of strategies. You can expand, you can turtle, you can rush, you can cheese, and it allows like kind of the sandbox type of play that core RTS players kind of can expect. However, there's disadvantages like we said, you can eliminate individual players. So we looked at alternate win conditions that exist elsewhere. So two of the alternate win conditions we looked at are, for example, the assassination win condition, which one example is from Supreme Commander, and also from a lot of MOBAs where you're forced to kill one big enemy building as kind of the win condition.
Mm-hmm.
That we feel is more focused, and it forces players to come together to know like what is my objective. So it's less roundabout, and players in a 3v3, for example, have more of an idea about what am I supposed to do in this particular game. Another type of win condition we're looking at is the kind of the victory point or capture the flag
Mm-hmm.
win condition that is in a lot of relic RTS games, such as the Company of Heroes franchise and the Dawn of War franchise, where you're kind of jostling over territory and you capture these points, and whoever gets the most points wins. So we're very interested in that kind of win condition as well because number one, it reinforces the idea of territory control, which is one of the core gameplay tenets of our game. We really want territory control to be important. And number two, in a team game, if players keep sending their units to jostle over these capture points in the middle of the map, then it allows players from both sides to passively scout each other.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the problems we feel like in 3v3 is not only do you have to keep track of your army, but you have to keep track of your allies' armies and then all three of your opponent's armies. And not only that, their economic states, like their positioning on the map. So it's a lot. So with capture points, it kind of helps to mitigate that problem because players are constantly encouraged to send their units to the middle of the map. It's sort of like in StarCraft where you kind of passively scout by poking at your opponent
Mm-hmm.
and forcing him to show his hand, show what units are you going to use to defend my attack, right? And when players are forced to, or players are encouraged to come to the middle of the map in order to do this, it allows for kind of passive scouting without necessarily threatening elimination from either of the players like you do in StarCraft with poking.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds really good. So that's going to be a completely separate game mode from 1v1, right? So 1v1 will probably be then, annihilation focused, and then 3v3 will have a different sort of objective. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. As much as we can, we're going to try to keep the unit balance very similar from between 1v1 and 3v3 so players can
Right.
jump between the game modes very similarly. However, we want to change like the surrounding game rules of the mode a lot.
Okay. So one of the things I was wondering about, how do you imagine the average like game of Stormgate to be like? What do you imagine them? Like how long, for example, do you think a game should last? Like 15 minutes is quite normal in StarCraft 2. Warcraft 3 can be, quite a bit longer already. Dota can be upwards of like an hour. Do you guys have like a certain amount of time for 1v1 and 3v3 in mind? Or is
Yeah.
it still up in
In
you?
our playtest, we've so I want to separate this between 1v1 and 3v3.
Mm-hmm.
For 3v3, we're aiming towards more predictable game lengths, and the game lengths that we're aiming for right now, based on the playtest we've been having, is somewhere around the 20-minute mark, with a relatively low standard deviation,
Okay.
so relatively low variance. However, on the 1v1 side, we're looking at at more variable game lengths, very similar to that of at the average of that being very similar to that of StarCraft or Warcraft, where it's somewhere in the low, let's say like 16-minute mark, but you're still allowed to have games that that end relatively early and games that end relatively late. That being said, we do want to kind of mitigate really early game losses as much as possible, and we want to mitigate the idea of the game going into 2-hour Turtle Fest as much as possible.
Right.
For the early game, we would like for there to be a slightly higher defender's advantage. And if you take a look at across all RTSs, I feel like the StarCraft franchise has some of the lowest defender's advantage in the early game, simply because there is no real defensive defender's advantage from the initial bases. I think a great something great we're shooting for is the idea of in Warcraft 3 you have these defensive buildings like burrows or defensive buildings like moonwells or blight that are innate defensive advantages that prevent you from being eliminated completely in the very, very early stages of the game, which can be really punishing for newer players. We also want to eliminate the idea that you have to learn to wall off in order to
Right.
defend your base. Specifically, like every time a new map pool gets released, Gemini has to post like a wall off
Yeah.
guide for every single map, right?
Or StarCraft
Um,
1, where you have to basically get a PhD to figure out how to get it done on
yeah.
every single map and every spawn location. It's pretty rough.
Yeah. When the distance between the buildings is based on the art
Right,
rather
yeah.
than something in the engine.
It has to look aesthetic as well. Like otherwise it doesn't work.
Yeah.
um
Depot Barracks is a wall, but Barracks Depot is not a wall.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Okay, so that makes
Um,
sense. So like early game, you shouldn't be able to just lose the game at the 2 minute mark as easily as you can in a
yeah.
game of StarCraft 2. So I guess there's a little bit less lethality in the early game and a bit
Yeah.
more leaning on the side of Warcraft then.
Yeah, I would say like we don't want to go too far with this. Another game that comes to mind is Company of Heroes, where you have these like kind of super turrets in the beginning of the game that defend your base. We still want players to be able to interact with each other's main bases. We just don't want the games to end immediately in the first 2 minutes, for example, with a proxy 2-racks.
Right. Yeah, makes sense. So as far as like unit lethality goes, right? So in StarCraft 2, one of the many complaints I've had over the years is that sometimes you get the notification that your army is under attack and you look back and the disruptor hit already went off or you already lost everything to Banelings or the Widow Mines already exploded. If you compare that to, for example, a Warcraft 3, like some of the battles can go on for, well, however long the players can micro for, like especially if you can micro backwards and stuff, there's a lot of ways to get them back into the battle later. Yeah, where do you guys think Stormgate is going to land there?
Yeah, so I'm just going to say it in the beginning. Stormgate, we're going to aim for something somewhere between the lethality of StarCraft 1 and that of Warcraft 3. And that means a lower lethality than that of StarCraft 2. And we're coming this from a lot of different approaches. So from the competitive aspect and both the 1v1 and the 3v3, there's the idea that in the early game, especially, you have a lot of players who just flat out lose the game because they weren't paying attention. They lose like 3 Marines, and therefore they lose the entire game because, again, a combination of high lethality and relatively low defender's advantage. And we want to make it so that if you're not paying attention for a second, and then in that 1 second you pan your screen back to the battle, you still have the opportunity to micro. You still have the opportunity to make the fight go your way a little more, so that it's less based on Twitch reactions and the ability to kind of like focus on or pay attention to all areas of the map at the exact same time. From the team aspect, when thinking of competitive 3v3, if you ever played a team game of StarCraft, let's talk about like a 2v2 game of StarCraft, right?
Mm-hmm.
What I've noticed a lot in 2v2 is that oftentimes in team fights, it's not actually two armies versus two armies. Because of the high lethality and high movement speeds of units in StarCraft 2, what I found is that you have these like two armies on one side and these two other armies on the other side. And then what happens is the first two armies fight each other, they
Mm-hmm.
instantly kill each other, and then the back two armies fight each other.
Right.
So it's less of a team fight, and there's less of opportunity for armies to synergize with each other. In Warcraft 3, Warcraft 3 I think really has a lot of reasons for why it does team modes really well, and one of them is the relative lower lethality. In Warcraft 3, when you have team fights, the fights actually feel like all the players are contributing in the fight, and the fights last long enough that you are given the opportunity to use team-based team-based abilities. For example, Holy Light, right?
Right.
Holy Light feels really good in a team-based setting because I'm using, my ally is using their energy and their cooldowns and their ability to heal on my unit, right? And that feels like my ally is actively trying to help me. So that's another reason for why we would like lower unit lethality. And then let's talk about it from the co-op side. In StarCraft 2 co-op, the entire game was built around the basis of StarCraft 2, right? And one problem with the relative high lethality of StarCraft 2, or let's say two problems, is that number one, we could never make debuffs feel good because the
Right.
game was really balanced around the idea of I'm just gonna kill you, I'm just gonna kill everything. And so the question for players was, why would I ever want to debuff an enemy when I can just kill them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Killing is always better than debuffing. So I think just the idea of buffs and debuffs are a really cool like class of ability that is found in a lot of games and something that we could never make work in StarCraft 2 co-op, which is something that we're going to try to expand on in Stormgate. And then secondly, because of the balance around high lethality, it was very difficult for us to scale difficulty in StarCraft 2 co-op because you often had these breakpoints of damage. Let's say you have this like nuke that does 500 damage and all the enemy units are under 500 HP. As soon as you raise the HP of those units to above 500,
Mm-hmm.
then everything is just gonna not die, and then you're gonna get rolled over because you didn't do enough damage. Right. So
Mm-hmm.
from the 1v1 perspective, from the 3v3 perspective, and for the co-op perspective, we feel like it makes a lot of sense to have lower unit lethality.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree. Like, one of the pieces of advice I've been giving people for a long time, whenever they try to get better at StarCraft, is to not look at the fights, and that feels incredibly counterintuitive, especially when you're new to the game. And I guess, yeah, making it a little more micro focused is definitely a good idea. So I do want to talk a little bit more about co-op in a second too, but um, as far as like multiplayer goes, so maybe this is once again going to be different in 3v3 and 1v1. StarCraft is kept at 200 supply. These other games are kept at different amounts of supply as well. I think a lot of that has to do with like engine limitations too. For example, I would have liked to see what StarCraft 2 would have played like if you had like 300 supply. I guess Zerg would be very overpowered. But where do you imagine Stormgate is going to be at?
Yeah, Stormgate. We're currently shooting. Everything I say, first of all, is
Mm-hmm.
still we're early in development. Blah blah blah.
Right.
But we are aiming for a 200 supply limit, similar to that of StarCraft 2. But another thing we're aiming for is a higher variability in terms of army sizes. So we're going to have some factions that are going to be greater than the numbers of units that you see for Zerg, for example. And we're also aiming for some factions that have a lower number of units than Protoss, for example. So
Okay.
higher diversity of unit counts.
Okay. So speaking of factions, then, so two have been announced so far. I think it's the Resistance, the Human Resistance, and Infernals, if I recall correctly.
Infernal hosts, yes.
Okay. All right. It's both two words. So it's Infernal Hosts and Human Resistance. Okay.
Mhm.
How many factions do you think there are gonna be? So that's one of the like I can't imagine, for example, like an extra race being added to StarCraft 2 right now, or well, for example, Warcraft 3, it would just completely break everything. If you compare it to, for example, like an Age of Empires 4, yes, there are way more factions there, but obviously the factions aren't nearly as unique. Are you guys planning on like adding a lot more in the future going forward too, or?
Well, all I can say there, Loco, is that we have 2 races announced now, and I can't wait to show you how many races or what races we add in the future.
All right.
That's my
Yeah, I
that's
can
my
imagine
best
like
PR
if
trained answer.
right now I get you. Yeah, I can imagine like if there would be an announcement for another race for StarCraft 2, a lot of people would definitely look at the game again because they would certainly be interested to see how that would play out. Even though it might throw the balance completely out of the window for at least a little while, that'd be fun to see.
Yeah, I mean, what I can say is that we are going to run the game as a free-to-play game and as a game as a service. So we're really dedicated to continually adding content for our players on a regular cadence. This not only allows players to expect expect regular updates from us on a very specific cadence. It also is a way for players who have left the game in order to have a placeholder or a time that they have in mind to
Mm.
return to the game. We learned a lot of lessons from Path of Exile,
Yeah.
where they actually learned lessons from streamers.
I come
In
back
that,
every season with Path of Exile too, pretty much. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, it's funny because like when hearing a lot of the GDC talks, one of the things they mentioned is like they learned a lesson from Kripparrian, and
Okay.
Kripparrian suggested like, hey, one of the reasons I'm successful or any streamer is successful is because they have regular stream times, right? So to take it into game development, like if a player like stops watching you or stops playing the game, they know like maybe in 3 months they'll have a new update, and I'll check out what the update is, and if that gets me excited. So our goal is to continuously have these updates and continuously have these updates that really cater towards all player segments. The
Okay.
player segments being competitive 1v1, competitive 3v3, cooperative 3ve, and campaign. So we're looking to
Okay.
continuously update our game on a regular cadence for all these game modes.
Okay. So if I understand correctly, that would mean that, well, you can't commit to a time frame, I'm sure, but say every 3 months there's going to be a new campaign chapter, a new co-op, whatever, and a new like multiplayer patch and 3v3 and all that. Okay. Is that how
Yeah. So
you?
yeah, besides committing to the time frame, yes, that is what we're shooting for.
Okay. No, that sounds awesome. Okay. So one thing that's come up a lot over the last few days, ever since you guys announced the game, is the fact that you're planning on keeping the skill ceiling very high, but lowering the skill floor. So one example I think that was given on the Steam page was the hotkeying situation,
Hmm.
where I think it automatically adds units to control groups as soon as you produce them. Are
Hmm.
there like other ways in which you guys are trying to make the game more accessible for newer players or for players that just don't have 700 actions per minute?
Yeah.
Players
So
with two hands, like.
exactly. We're thinking about that from a lot of angles. The first one I want to talk about is the tutorialization angle. We realize that traditionally in RTS, the tutorials aren't particularly robust, and we want to do better in that regards. Specifically, we want to do better in terms of being able to onboard your friend into a game. Anecdotally, one thing we realized on during our time on StarCraft 2 is whenever we see like a random person on the street and we ask them, hey, do you play StarCraft? And how did you get into StarCraft? The answer that I've seen in the last like 4 or so years generally is that they got into StarCraft, specifically into StarCraft co-op, because their friend got them into it. So tutorialization, specifically tutorialization with a friend, is something we're looking into. Next, I want to talk about it from the UI and the user experience perspective, something that Ryan is more of an expert in, but I'll do my best here.
Right.
So you already brought up the idea of automated control groups. I would say generally with all our improvements to user experience, we're going to try to make it so that there are these ways in which you can engage with the game that is more automatic rather than manual, but you still have these manual options should you choose to engage with them. So with the automated control groups, yes, if a Marine comes out of your barracks, it can get inserted into hotkey 1, for instance, and that might be good for even the top players, but it might not be ideal, right?
Mm.
If it keeps getting inserted into hotkey 1, you might have the opportunity for your reinforcements to get picked off, right? So
Right.
like innovation, often he just rallies his Marines into a depot, and he brings them groups at a time so that they're less vulnerable to Zergling run-bys or Zergling pickoffs, right? So that's an example of a place where it might actually not be optimal to use the automated control groups. Another example of UX improvements is the idea of merge command cards, where we want to give players the opportunity to use multiple abilities from the same command card. The best
Okay.
example here is Ravens and Marines, right? In StarCraft 2, you have to keep tabbing between different abilities or different units in order to engage with both the Stim and the Raven abilities. And I know that particular example is one that a
Yeah.
lot of players in StarCraft 2 really struggle with. Um,
So like Tigers in co-op then.
yeah, exactly. It's largely inspired, or a large part is inspired from the success of Taikisen Co-op, where yes, you do have these like 5 heroes, but you're able to use all their abilities from a single command card. And then another idea is the idea of a quick macro panel. So let's say I want to build a command center, right? Um, there's two ways in Stormgate that you'll be able to do that. Number one is like in traditional StarCraft, where you select an SCV or you select a worker and then you build that command center. Another way you can do it in Stormgate is you go into a panel where you can build a command center. You can just select to build a command center, and the game will automatically pick what it considers the best worker to build that command center with.
Right.
So there's actually like a lot of intricacies there about like what the best worker is, and we feel like um, a lot of how the system is going to work is what determines the system is going to work well or not is if we get all these rules correct. One of the cool things about StarCraft that a lot of people don't notice is that it's really good at intuiting what you're trying to do,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not immediately the most obvious thing from a design standpoint. So it takes a lot into human psychology, and it just tries to do the thing that you think you want to do. It thinks you want to do.
Yeah, I ran
So
into that with Age of Empires 4 when I was double clicking my army control group and it just centers wherever the units are. Like I think
yeah,
it's like a weighted center and you just stare at the middle of the fog of war. Yeah, in
yeah,
StarCraft 2, I've never even noticed that, but it's very intelligent there. Yeah.
that's a great example. Yeah, in StarCraft 2, it goes to like the largest weight of your units rather than the actual center.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, with the quick macro panel, that's another example of a mechanic where for an average player, for a new player especially, it's going to be really easy to use the quick macro panel, but it's not always going to select the quote unquote best SCV, right? You might want to individually using your own like pro player judgment in order to select a better SCV, and in that way, this allows more experienced players to get more out of the game, to get that
Mm-hmm.
extra edge over a newer player who might just want to build a command center and get like 10% less efficiency, for example.
Right, because I
So
can
I thought,
imagine like the worker would have to also walk over there, right? So if you have
yeah.
to start up a command center or whatever on the low ground and the SCV has to come out of the main, you're going to be at like
Mhm.
500 minerals by the time it gets there. Okay.
Yeah, and then in some circumstances, like let's take an example from StarCraft 2. You might want to actually generally you want to pull a worker from minerals, but sometimes you actually might want to pull a worker from gas, right? Or you might
Mm.
want to one of your workers might be building a barracks, and you want that worker to build your factory instead of like an arbitrary worker, right?
Right. Or you want to shift
Um,
queue it or something along those lines, right? So these are
exactly.
they all sound like additions that indeed would like make the game a little bit more approachable. But if
Mhm.
you want to optimize, you're probably better off doing it manually. Is that basically
Exactly.
the yeah, okay.
Exactly. And I want to so I talked about tutorialization. I talked about UX improvements. I also want to talk about gameplay.
Mhm.
How can we lower the skill floor without lowering the skill ceiling in gameplay? So I want to take two examples from two separate Blizzard RTSs. In StarCraft 1, and to an extent in StarCraft 2, you have Reaver drops and Warp Prism drops. And in both these examples, especially with the Reaver drop, there's a lot of nuance in how you do it. The Reaver, the shuttle specifically works very differently in terms of depending on what commands you give it and where you move it. So, for example, if you ever stop the shuttle, it takes a really long time for it to accelerate back to full speed. So you want to keep the shuttle in movement, and you at the same time you want to keep you want to dodge all of like the missile turrets or the Goliaths, for example.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of it's a very simple interaction, and a newbie player will be able to still do Reaper drops, but because of the interesting move mechanics in StarCraft One, there's going to be a lot of ways for a more experienced player to get more out of the Reaver drop. Another example I want to give is from Warcraft 3. with auto cast abilities, which is something that we're looking heavily into in StarCraft 2. So traditionally, with auto cast abilities in Warcraft 3, there's rules that the game knows about when to auto cast them. So as a newbie player, my first sorceress comes out and the auto cast is turned on. So it's just gonna cast slow on anything that is attacking. Those are the rules in Warcraft 3. So what it's not going to do is it's going to cast slow on creeps, number one.
Right.
So maybe as a better player, as a more experienced player, I'm going to turn it off during creep battles, and I'm going to turn it back on during battles with enemies. Another way you can get extra things from slow is, let's say you have one sorceress and you don't necessarily want to slow the entire enemy army. You just want to slow one key unit, like the Demon Hunter. Then you're also going to turn auto cast off, and you're going to cast it specifically on the Demon Hunter. And finally, slow only works on units that are attacking you. So let's say like an enemy unit just run past you and is not attacking you. Then the slow will not cast on that unit, but you still want to slow it down in order to kill it. So you're still going to want to manually cast slow. So that's another example of how we give players the ability to kind of just A move this unit and still get some effectiveness, while at the same time allowing for a lot of skill to show through.
Yeah, no, this all sounds really good. Like it would definitely make the game a little bit more accessible for for a lot of people that are struggling to get onto, well, for example, the ladder. One thing I've had for many years, I've had people reaching out to me specifically about ladder anxiety, and it's almost like a thing that people get like a little bit embarrassed about. So I know one of the comparisons that's been drawn quite a bit over the last couple of weeks is, or last couple of days, I guess, is Elden Ring, where it's a very difficult game, and RTS games are difficult as well. In a game like Elden Ring, when you're failing over and over and over again on a boss fight, you can still sort of quantify your progress by seeing the boss's health bar going lower and lower and lower every time, right? Maybe the first time you get him down to 90%, but then the 17th time you get him down to 20%, and eventually you can get the kill. I think in a game of StarCraft, one of the reasons why a lot of people get that ladder anxiety and why they're almost concerned about going onto the ladder is because it's really hard to quantify that progression. So maybe you were very close to beating the opponent this time around, but you still are presented with defeat right in the middle of the screen at the end, and you don't actually get a whole lot out of it. Is this something you guys are planning on addressing as well?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things that we're thinking about with regards to ladder anxiety. I'll first chime in on what you just talked about, which is a feeling of progression and a feeling of like accomplishment after a game. A lot of things that we're looking into are number one, the idea of greater progression in Stormgate, greater opportunities for progression, both in the co-op modes and as a whole. So in StarCraft 2, kind of famously, that you are kind of capped to level 60 with
Mm-hmm.
all your characters, and we want to expand that and make sure that each individual win or each individual game that you play is meaningful. Not just like from whether you win or lose, but you actually are being rewarded for every minute that you play for in Stormgate. Something else we want to do is we want to be able to more call out the things that you did better, and the improvements that you could make in each of the games. So in StarCraft 2, we had, you were supply blocked for less often, or you had a higher APM than average. So we want to do more in that category, where the game is not necessarily just about the binary factor of did you win or did you lose, but more about like the surrounding improvements, or the road to improvements. So with regards to ladder anxiety, we're also thinking about it in a few other ways. The first is um, we're going to have a mode that is really tuned in for team-based play. And I feel like team-based play, especially anecdotally, I've been playing a lot of team games. Team-based play has
You can blame your
generally,
allies. Like,
you can blame your allies, and it does have lower anxiety. Yeah, like not only can you blame your allies, I think it's more calming to play, especially in a range team where you're just hanging out with your friends, you're kind of chilling, and it's less about like whether you win or lose.
mm-hmm.
Another thing that I've noticed more recently is the way in which you enter ladder games. So in StarCraft 2, you're queuing up and you find a game, and there's like this huge blaring sound, and then you get into the loading screen, and you see your opponent's race in the map, and you have to process this a lot, and then you get into the game. So two ways in which I've noticed that that process is improved is number one by adding the countdown screen um,
Mm-hmm.
after the game loads. I feel like um, the uncertainty of when the game loads is like a big factor of like, oh my god, I have to be prepared, I have to prepare the whole time. And another example of a situation where I find there's less anxiety is an Age of Empires, where the information of the race, the enemy race, and the map is kind of stagnated. Like you queue into a game, you get into the game, and you get into another preload screen of where you kind of discover what your opponent's race and what your opponent's map is, so that you're able to digest all of this information on a slower cadence.
Mm-hmm.
And in my experience, that also is helpful for ladder anxiety as well. So those are kind of some of the things that we're thinking about in order to deal with that ladder anxiety.
All right. No, that sounds good. So one thing I heard you touch on, I think when you were talking to the Back to Warcraft guys, is the unit pathing in particular. So one thing I've noticed with Blizzard RTS games is that unit pathing is miles better than every other RTS I've tried. Like one of the problems I run into with all of the other ones is that it just feels slow and sluggish. Yeah, could you talk about that a little bit as far as Stormgate goes?
Yes. So for Stormgate, we're of course using the Unreal 5 engine, which has a lot of rendering power, and it's great from a graphical perspective. However, it's not innately built for RTS. There's a lot of networking, and there's a lot of pathfinding we have to write on top of that.
Mm-hmm.
So in order to accomplish all of that, we're creating this thing called Snowplay, which is a custom-built and very highly configurable, extremely efficient gameplay simulation, and that is going to unlock low bandwidth multiplayer game features. And essentially, what this means is it's kind of like a thing built on top of Unreal that allows us to do our entire game logic. It's going to be led by James Anhalt, who was the lead pathfinding engineer on StarCraft 2. He's already expressed that, oh, I wish I could have done this better in StarCraft
That
2,
that's
or
that's
I
honestly
wish I
one of
could
the
have done
biggest
better.
things. Like every RTS game I've tried, like I make this joke all the time about Age of Empires 4 that like after playing that for like 2 months, it felt like StarCraft 2 was the game that just released compared to AOE 4, just because it feels like you're walking through like mud. Like every move you do just takes too much time and it's all a little bit too slow.
Yeah.
But to hear that the same person that was in charge of StarCraft 2's pathing is also in charge over here is it's probably a good thing. One thing I've had multiple people ask me, if I could ask you, will there be, and I don't know if you can answer this directly, but will there be a 1v1 ladder on launch? Because I think this is
I think
specifically because of Warcraft 3 or 4, it's an AoE 4 and all that.
Yeah, I actually did answer this on the Back to Warcraft channel as well when I did that interview,
Okay.
and they are specifically
Right,
they,
yeah, okay, I get it.
yeah,
Yeah.
but yes, there will be a 1v1 ladder at launch.
Okay.
I,
No,
I
that's
can
that's
speak to
kind
that.
of this is kind of important. Yeah. Okay. No, I'm glad to hear that. And lastly, I was wondering as far as like the 1v1 aspect goes. Since you're so open about it, right, and you're talking about the multiplayer game design at all, are you concerned at all about becoming like David Kim 2.0, where everyone's just gonna blame all their losses on you?
I think that that comes with the territory, and hopefully I won't be David Kim 2.0. I'll be Kevin Dong 1.0. That is my goal.
All right, that's the goal. Okay. I can already imagine there's gonna be some forum posts or Reddit posts where people are just blaming everything on you, and I don't think that's
Yeah,
entirely fair, but yeah, it's one of the downsides of being very public about it, I guess.
yeah, and my name is so much more memeable.
It will be more memeable, yes. I already saw the flexing photographs as well. I can already imagine the. No, I think they were like this, right? Anyways, the pictures.
I don't know what you're talking
No,
about,
you don't know what I'm
Loco.
talking about. I think that's on every single thumbnail I've seen of you the last couple of weeks. But yeah, I can already imagine the text above it and the text below it. But anyways, yeah, it comes with the territory. Okay, so I think that's about enough of multiplayer then. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about the campaign and a little bit about co-op as well. So it almost seems like those are like one category, since if I understand correctly, you can play the campaign with two people as well.
hmm Yeah, so for the campaign, so it's going to be a little different from co-op in that the campaign we're really going to focus on the story aspect of it. We feel like that's where our lore is really going to shine, and where you really learn about the history of what our universe is about. We realize not everyone really cares about the history. We have like Tasteless, for example, asking who's Amon in a GSL cast.
Yeah, this happens all the time. Those guys are just like there's like a very select group of StarCraft players that just go to 1v1 right away. But that is probably
Uh,
like 0.1% of the player base that just
yeah.
goes only to 1v1.
But the funny thing is like there's also like a huge segment of players that really deeply care about the lore.
Yeah,
And
I do. I
here's a
do.
shout out. Yeah. Well, here's a shout out specifically to the StarCraft co-op or the StarCraft like lore Discord. There's like a Discord full of people who really care about the lore. So that's the service that segment, and the co-op mode that we're planning is to serve the segment that really wants to replay the games over and over again, to have like a PVE challenge that they can kind of complete, and then they kind of tweak on, like they can customize their abilities, they can go into gradually harder and harder modes. So for the nerd like me who like just wants to be the best, or wants to to play with as many cool toys in an RTS as possible.
Cool. Yeah, so I can imagine then, yeah, new chapters get added as well, right? Like you were saying with those seasonal events. So the campaign is going to be like an ongoing experience. Then it's not going to be like Wings of Liberty, Heart of the Swarm, and a Legacy of the Void, and then that's basically it. It's going to be like an ongoing process for foreseeable future.
Exactly. We have story beats for up to 5 years after we launch. And how I would imagine it is that it's going to be very similar to the Nova covert ops campaigns, where
Hmm.
they were released gradually, let's say 3 missions at a time, over the course of many months. So it'll be like that, but over a longer period of time.
Sounds fantastic. Yeah. With co-op mode in particular, I think pretty much everyone that's going to be listening to this or watching this is well familiar with the StarCraft 2 co-op. Um, will the Stormgate co-op be comparable to the StarCraft co-op in a lot of ways, or is it going to be much different?
Yeah, I would say that for the co-op mode, it's really going to be heavily based around StarCraft 2 co-op. We feel like StarCraft 2 co-op was very unique, and it was in many ways the first of what it was at the time. So compared to every other game mode in Stormgate, we feel like it's going to be more like StarCraft 2 the StarCraft 2 version of it,
Mm-hmm.
but 2.0. So a few ways it's going to be different. Number one, the very obvious way it's going to be different is it's going to be 3-player PVE. We've always wanted to do something like this in StarCraft 2, but a large part because of the technological limitations of the StarCraft engine, we were unable to do so. We feel like a 3-player game mode allows for number one, greater virality and the ability to bring more friends into the game. And number two, it allows for greater cooperation abilities. Player one can cooperate with player two. A player one can cooperate with player three, and then all three players can cooperate. So number one, there's going to be more players. Number two, speaking of cooperation, we're going to have more cooperation opportunities for players. We in StarCraft 2, commanders were designed with the idea that, oh, I can solo the map if I want to, and the cooperation abilities were more of an afterthought. I think Artanis is the best example of a commander that is really able to help his ally,
Mm-hmm.
and he maybe has like two, maybe three cooperation mechanics in mind. So in Stormgate, we're going to design it such that every commander is going to have somewhere between 3 to 5 opportunities for cooperation, and we're also going to design it to make it sure that the cooperation feels good. There's a lot of abilities in co-op where, yes, they are technically cooperative and they are high impact, but they don't necessarily feel high impact.
Mm-hmm.
So, as an example, you even with like for Abathur's ability, he has like a global heal, but oftentimes what is happening is he just is healing his own units,
Yeah,
and
you use it when you
and
see you're running low, right?
yeah, and then like your ally's like, oh, this is a cool bonus, I guess.
Would have
Like,
been
but
helpful
often,
30 seconds ago.
exactly.
Right.
You played enough co-op to
Yeah,
understand
I've
this.
played plenty of it. Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. So I guess that bundled together with like the pacing of the combat being a bit slower then will probably also create more room for that to be noticeable, right? Because since everything in StarCraft 2 just kind of blows up anyways, it doesn't really feel very impactful oftentimes.
Yeah, so just an example, like the idea of buffs is something uh, that I think is going to be noticed a lot more in Stormgate. The ability to help your ally via this thing that persists over time. So yeah, that's number two, more cooperation abilities.
Mm-hmm.
Number three, and I think this is the really big one, is we're going to build Stormgate co-op with um, from scratch with the idea that it's going to be supported long term. A big problem with StarCraft 2 co-op is that initially when it was released back in 2015 with like the Legacy of the Void launch, it was not seen as something that was going to be hyper successful.
Mm-hmm.
The anecdote that I like to tell is that the StarCraft team was really hyped up on Archon mode, and
Right.
and StarCraft 2 co-op was like more of an afterthought. The team at the time thought, oh, maybe they'd play these commanders like for 10 hours. But in reality, players engage with these commanders for hundreds or even thousands of hours.
Right.
And because of that, the team had to pivot into more co op development, um, in which they had to add content and add features every given year. However, the problem with this is that the team was never sure whether that was ever going to be the last year of co-op development. So
Right.
every year they built like the next best thing, and then the next best thing on top of that, and the next best thing on top of that. And by the end of it, you saw like this. I like to call this like tower of Jenga blocks, where each individual block was very solid on its own. But when you take a step back, you realize, oh,
Mm.
it's not as like cohesive. The tower doesn't look as pretty as we would like it to be. So in Stormgate, we're going to approach this. We're going to try to build a tower um, as a whole, as a cohesive unit. And what that means is we're going to have progression systems and we're going to have customization systems that make sense for the long term. And we're going to allow players to more greatly customize their commanders and more play with the tail end of the game in mind, such that there's greater replayability and you can actually play this game for thousands of hours to come.
That all sounds absolutely fantastic. Yeah, I'm excited. I really hope it all works out as well as you guys are intending to, because it honestly sounds great. So one big thing that's been asked a lot about is the monetization of the game, right? So you already brought up just now that the game is going to be free to play. I'm assuming those different seasons that you guys are planning on releasing then, so they will have pieces of campaign and co-op and multiplayer and all that added into it. I'm assuming those are going to be purchasable. Are there going to be other things in game that you plan on monetizing?
Yeah, we don't have specific plans about exactly what we're monetizing besides the fact that number one, we're never going to have pay to win mechanics in competitive game modes, um, and we're going to rather monetize things such as cosmetics or out of game like portraits and things like that. We are going to every season release new story content, new heroes, new skins, new cosmetics, just new content overall, and this will allow players to decide what content they like to engage with. Players can ask themselves, what pillar of the community am I? Do I engage with PvE? Do I engage with PvP? And we allow them to choose the game modes that they would like to support. This allows the development team to sustain ongoing development, and in a way that allows like the game, the team, and the community to thrive for years to come.
Okay. That sounds good. So you just brought up Heroes briefly. Is that a thing you guys are considering as well for multiplayer?
Yeah, so we're taking a look at heroes and experimenting with heroes in all our game modes.
Okay.
We feel like there's a lot of benefits to heroes, and we thought about it on our own. We brought the topic to the Frost Giant Reddit, and one of the biggest conclusions around heroes is primarily players have two primary complaints about heroes, and those are the complaints of over centralization and the threat of snowballing. With
Mm-hmm.
regards to over centralization, oftentimes the heroes are so impactful. Let's take a look at Warcraft 3, for example. They're so impactful in Warcraft 3 that you're encouraged to center everything around that hero, and there's less opportunity for multitasking overall.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is a problem not necessarily 100% because of heroes in Warcraft 3. For example, there's not really like a strong Zergling unit or a strong Marine drop
Mm-hmm.
ability in Warcraft 3. There's fewer opportunities to pull part of your army from your quote unquote death ball in order to deal harassment. But we feel like yes, this is still a problem with heroes where you're heavily encouraged to center around the hero. And the second problem is the idea of snowballing in Warcraft 3. For every kill that you get, it's permanently tracked on your hero. So
Mm-hmm.
um, every small win that you get, it can kind of be like a permanent way in which your opponent is gaining power, and you can't. It's harder to come back in that way, because in StarCraft 2, even if your unit dies, you can kill the units that killed that unit, and you can kind of come back there. But there's no such mechanic, or less of an ability to do so in Warcraft 3. So with those things in mind, the way we're experimenting with heroes in a Stormgate is basically special units that don't necessarily have leveling and don't necessarily carry items. When I think a big trap that a lot of Blizzard RTS players fall into is when I talk about heroes, they think no heroes like in StarCraft 2 or Warcraft 3 like
Right.
heroes with the whole shebang, with the leveling, with the items. And I think that's actually like a huge spectrum, and there's a lot of room in between. In addition to just a special unit that doesn't have leveling, we're also thinking a lot about the lethality of our heroes. I think it can feel really bad for one unit to kill 100 units or like 40 units even. So I
Mm-hmm.
think the best example there. So a thing that a lot of people don't know about is I actually back before I worked at Blizzard, I actually quit StarCraft back in the Heart of the Swarm days. And I remember the very specific reason I did so. It was after I was watching an innovation game against Protoss on Frost, back
Mm-hmm.
when there was the Mothership Core and when there was Pylon. Wait, I think it was late Legacy. It was late Legacy, and there was the Pylon overcharge ability.
Right.
And at that time, like the meta was like you have to kill the Protoss opponent in order to win the game. It was a very Terran was playing a very tempo based game, more so than today. And what happened is, I think innovation spawned in the top left, and the Protoss player spawned in the top right. And the innovation was aiming for a Doom drop with 4 medevacs into the Protoss player's base. And then he saw a few pylons and a mothership core on top of the pylons, and he turned around. Just
Yeah, it's
just
the
just because,
worst. I
yeah,
can I,
just
I don't
because of that one
recognize the
unit.
exact game, but I can 100% imagine the feeling. You're like, he's doing it and he's not.
Exactly. And I think it just feels bad that like this one unit can be so lethal that it can deter 40 supply of units. This 2 supply unit can defer 40 supply of units.
Hmm.
So with our design of heroes, we're heavily looking into the potential lethality of these heroes. Um, I know the mothership core especially was a very controversial unit, but taking a look into like taking an analysis into like why that was, I have to say that like I think it was because of the number one, the high lethality of the unit, and number two, because it existed in a game and in a franchise where special units or heroes were not really present. There wasn't really something analogous on the
Hmm.
Terran or the Zerg.
Yeah, also probably because like it was kind of like a band-aid on top of the Protoss early game, right? Like the Stalkers and the Zealots kind of sucked, so I guess now we have this new unit that can just kind of save you most of the time, and it's yeah. I don't think it was particularly well implemented in StarCraft 2, but in a way, I guess in SC2 you also do have some sort of hero units, right? Like not just the Mothership, but also like a War Prism is almost like a hero unit that is
Mhm.
extremely powerful, but you're not likely to make multiples of them. And there's like a couple of examples of that in the game. Is so you're more aiming for like hero units that are maybe not around the level of a War Prism, but more in that range.
Yeah, I would say the War Prism also has a potential to be highly lethal as well. But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
somewhere in the range of like these are like supporting units that can help your ally. Maybe they can do like a bunch of damage, but they're never going to be able to solo like supplies of armies that are like 10 times the supply of them.
Okay, yeah, no Blade Masters.
No.
You just spin everything dies. Yeah, that would not be ideal. So okay, so that will probably then also be one of the things that you can monetize the game with, then I imagine. So how do you want to ensure that the games and the esports side of things do not become pay to win in general? So you just mentioned that you want to make sure that they do not become so, but if you only play one versus one, there's other than cosmetics not a whole lot to buy then, if I understand correctly.
Yeah, we want to. So there's a lot of games in the market that follow this model of not releasing like pay to win mechanics and allowing players to buy cosmetics and buy portraits in order to support the game. And we feel like with that model, we are still going to allow ourselves to be sustainable
Okay.
in order to continue development of the game.
Okay. No, that sounds good. Like a Dota system, I guess, right? Where it's mostly skins. No, that sounds fantastic. So some companies, like for example, Riot, handle most of their esports themselves with League of Legends. Um, I heard you guys talk a little bit about community-run tournaments as well. Are you guys planning on like running most of the esports yourself? Like, for example, what we had with StarCraft for a very long time as well, where it's directly run by Blizzard. Or do you plan on mostly letting the community run that sort of thing?
Yeah, so I don't have any like specific plans to announce for our esports system, and I think Trevor Houston, our senior esports director, can talk more about that.
Mm-hmm.
But I will say is two things that we're looking into, or a few things we're looking into our esports. Number one, we want a lot of community integration. With our esports, we don't want to do something like a big league where you only Frost Giant can curate the esports and everyone is locked out. We want to have a system where the community tournaments matter and the path to pro is more obvious. There are community tournaments that you can participate in that help you get to that pro level, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Number two, we're going to try to make esports accessible to everyone, more approachable to everyone. And we're going to try to do that by having more in-client esports. And what that means is all you have to do is click play and within the game, and you're taken to esports instead of having to register via like a second party or third party website, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And number three, we're going to try to integrate esports with our content releases. So for every season of let's say our version of WCS or our version of our esports circuit, we're going to try to tie it in with with a content release. After a season ends, we're going to try to have the next content drop. So it feels like the
Mm.
esports and the game timings are very tied together, and it feels like a cohesive product.
Right, so it's like a balanced reset every time, I guess, as well, right? For the esports scene specifically, it
Yeah,
doesn't make a lot of sense when you have the finals coming up to then release a patch right before that. That changes everything.
exactly. Yeah, and what that also allows us to do, it also allows us a predictable time for us to kind of shake up the game or make any balance adjustments we want to. That's not to say that we won't make balance adjustments outside of these like season locks,
Mm-hmm.
but it just allows us a very predictable timing for when the next balance patch is going to hit. I know in StarCraft 2, there's always questions about like, oh, when's the next balance patch going to be? Is there ever going to be a next balance patch? And
It's the
with this
story of my
system,
life. Yes. No, I love that
uh,
system. That sounds like a very good idea. Obviously, it depends on how frequently those sort of things are, but yeah, I can imagine. It's nice knowing when the new stuff is gonna come. Right, you're not always guessing when new stuff will be releasing. Um,
mhm.
so I can see the comparison that you made with Kripparrian. I know is specifically extremely consistent with streaming. Um, yeah, it's nice to know if you can expect new content again in a week or two, or if it's going to be 3 months from now. But at the very least, that you know something is going to come.
Mhm.
So I think we discussed most aspects of the game. The only thing, and I personally don't really know too much about this sort of thing. The only thing that we didn't really touch upon, unless I missed something, is the editor. Um, so I've never really made any maps or custom games myself. One thing that I was wondering about is that originally in StarCraft 2, the maps that we're playing on, specifically in cooperative, or sorry, in competitive rather, they were all made by Blizzard themselves. And then at some point we had like the Team Liquid map contest, and that power was shifted to the community, where now the community are the ones making the maps. Are you foreseeing a similar thing happening with this as well, or do you think like the community could play an even bigger role with the editor?
Yeah, in terms of competitive maps in particular, the way I see Stormgate development going is very similar or even identical to that of how it worked in StarCraft 2, where initially we're the one with with the editor, with the terrain editor, and we're going to be releasing the initial maps. But as the community develops, as it learns the rules of the game and like how to make great maps, I think we'll gradually see more of a shift to community-made maps in competitive play.
Okay. No, that's awesome. So the editor will be just a fully fledged edition of, like, for example, the Warcraft 3 editor or the StarCraft 2 editor, right? If I understand correctly, where you can make like your entire custom games.
Yeah, we're going to try to make some improvements to those editors as well. And
Okay.
specifically, what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to have the power of the StarCraft editor with the combined with the accessibility and approachability of the Warcraft 3 editor. I don't know how familiar you are with this, but there's been
Not
a
really.
lot of complaints throughout the history of StarCraft that the editor was extremely unapproachable. You had to know a lot in order to deal with it. So one thing we're going to do, one improvement is, um, it's going to be funny for you if you've never heard of this, but it was actually extremely difficult to copy and paste a unit. If you had a
Okay.
Marine and you wanted to make a Super Marine, you would actually need a ton of knowledge in order to do so in StarCraft 2. And so in Warcraft 3, it's more of a copy paste method, but in StarCraft 2, there was no such way you could do so for a very long time until the 5.0 patch that released about 2 years ago.
Hmm.
So that's one thing we're really focusing on is the ability to essentially copy code from a pre-established code, even from Frost Giant code or Frost Giant units that you can trust is going to be accurate and it functions properly. The second thing we're going to do in that vein is we're going to have an easy mode to the editor, and we're going to have more advanced fields. So if you're going to be using the easy mode, you're going to be able to adjust very basic attributes like hit points, like weapon damage, right? All those tiny things. And it's going to be more approachable for a very new player. But for a more veteran map maker, especially a more veteran custom map maker, we're going to allow you to opt into the more advanced modes that traditionally StarCraft 2 mod makers have access to.
All right. No, that all sounds fantastic. It sounds like basically every point of making like a spiritual successor to StarCraft 2 or a Warcraft 3 or whatever is taken into account. I don't really notice. I haven't really heard anyone talk about anything in particular that's missing. So I can imagine it's a lot of work to try and get done. So just to wrap up, when can we play?
Well, right now, you know what you can do, Loco?
I think
This
I
is
could
my
go to
pre
playstormgate.com, can't
Oh
I?
my God! How did you know? How did you know? You can go to that website and not only sign up for the beta, you also are going to sign up for the newsletter there. Loco, you know what else can really help us a lot
Mm-hmm.
is if you wishlist us on Steam. This actually helps us a lot with the Steam algorithm, and it props
Okay.
us to the top when we finally we're going to release our beta and when we release our game, and then also you can tell your friends to do the same things as go to playstormgate.com and wishlist the game on Steam.
Add it to your Steam list. Make sure that you support them in whatever way you can for the time being. That's pretty much all you can do, I guess, other than sign up for the beta. All right, so thank you very much for your time. I really hope that the team can get everything done that you guys are planning on doing, because honestly, it sounds fantastic. As someone who's a big fan of RTS games, this seems to be, by far the most promising RTS that's actually pretty soon on the horizon as well. I didn't expect it was going to be beta. I think Tim said next year already, right? Like 2023?
Yep, mid 2023.
Okay, yeah. So it's not even that far in the distance or in the future. So I'm very excited for it.
Well, we got a lot of work to do, and I guess it's time for me to get back to work.
Thank you very much.